guys, welcome to week 8's material. This week we're going to be looking at some bones, some back muscles, some muscles of the rotator cuff, um, as well as the brachial plexus. So to first get us started off, I want to look at the humerus. Let's get started off there. Okay, so I'm going to do thorax in the arm. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is the humerus. So again, before we do this, I want to remind you guys that this is meant to be a supplement and not a replacement for your time spent in lecture, office hours, or your own lab. So be sure to spend time there before you look at these videos. But for now, let's get into the material. Okay, so we have the humerus first, right? So I'm going to click on the humerus, I'm going to examine, and then inspect, right? So on the humerus, we have the greater and lesser tuberosity, or tubercle. So greater or lesser tuberosity slash tubercle of the humerus, right? So greater is here, lesser is here, right? You can kind of see those indentations there, greater and lesser. So greater, lesser. You can kind of see those indentations there. All right, and then you have your head of your humerus, which is going to articulate with the glenoid fossa, making your glenohumeral joint. So glenohumeral joint, right? So we have our glenoid fossa of our scapula, and then our head of our humerus, glenohumeral joint. Right, so this is our humeral head or head of the humerus. Right, and then you have your neck of the humerus, and then you have your shaft. Right, but we don't need to know that for now. Um, Now we're going to move on to our clavicle. So there are two ends of our clavicle, and as of now, when we're looking at bones, some of the wording gets mixed up. So I want to make sure that we're very clear on what some of these sections of these bones are, and make sure we're not confusing them with other sections, right? So we have our clavicle here. Right here we have our sternal end because it's articulating with the sternum, and then here we have our acromial end because it's articulating with our acromion process of the scapula. So sternal end, acromial end. This is our clavicle, sternal and acromial end of our clavicle. So examine, inspect, right? So our sternal end is going to have like this flat edge, right? Where our acromial end is going to be kind of rounded, a little sharp. Right, so acromial end, don't get acromial end confused with acromion process. Right, so now let's look at our scapula. Right, so our scapula here, we can see that. Now let's inspect it. So we have our scapula. Right, the first thing I want to get started with the scapula is looking at the borders, and then we'll go into some of the other accessory structures. So this is the medial border, right? It's towards the midline of the body, so medial border of the scapula. This is our lateral border of the scapula, right? It's toward the lateral side of the body. Then we also have our inferior angle of the scapula, right? So inferior angle. I'm going to just inspect it, right? So I said, so medial border, lateral border, inferior angle of the scapula. We also have our scapular spine, right? A scapular spine is here. Right, and then we have our acromion process. And then right here we have our coracoid process. Right, let me let you guys see that better. Right, so if I let you see it from a frontward perspective, I mean an anterior perspective, um, right, so this is going to be our coracoid process. This is going to be our acromion process. So acromion, I always memorize it as above the coracoid process, so that A for above. And then we have the coracoid process, which is below the acromion process. Right, and then we have our glenoid fossa. Right, this is where the head of our humerus is going to sit inside of, right, and it's going to make our glenohumeral joint. So now that we have that, we're going to move on to the muscles. Let me get that open for you guys. All right, so the first muscle that we're going to look at is the deltoid. All right, so, right, the deltoid here. So our deltoid is this big muscle on our shoulder, right? The deltoid. If I inspect, all right, we have our whole shoulder joint here, our whole, right, and then we can see the deltoid, right? So the deltoid, it goes from the acromion process, right? We can see it going from the acromion process to the sternum. Sorry, it goes from the acromion process to the spine of the scapula and the humerus. Sorry, so it goes from the acromion process, scapular spine, and also goes to the humerus. Right, we can see it going to the clavicle as well, but that's more so the acromial end. Right, and our deltoid is going to be responsible for abducting, flexing, extending, and medially and laterally rotating the glenohumeral joint. Right, so right, we can see its attachment points. Again, it goes from the scapular spine, the acromion process, all the way to the humeral shaft, and we can see it at the acromial end of the clavicle as well. Right. So now that we have that, we're going to move on to our next structure, which is trapezius. Sorry, which is pectoralis major. So pectoralis major is right here. So pec major. All right. So pec major, we can see it attaching from the ribs, the sternum, right? Ribs, sternum, and it also attaches to the clavicle and then all the way to the humeral shaft. All right. So we see it going from the ribs, sternum, clavicle, humeral shaft. Right. The humeral shaft is distal attachment point. Right, and this muscle is responsible for adducting, flexing, medially rotating the glenohumeral joint, and it's innervated by the lateral pectoral nerve and the medial pectoral nerve. Unlike pectoralis minor, which is only innervated by the medial pectoral nerve. Right, so the medial pectoral nerve innervates pec major and pec minor. The lateral pectoral nerve only innervates pectoralis major. So now I'm going to I'm going to press pectoralis major there. All right, so we have pectoralis major, sorry, pectoralis minor here, sorry. So pectoralis minor is responsible for elevating the ribs, right? I said previously that it's innervated by the medial pectoral nerve. It goes from the ribs all the way to the coracoid process, right? And it has some attachment here to the acromion process. So, right, this muscle is responsible for elevating the ribs. Now we're going to look at the next muscle, which is biceps brachii. So let me remove all these here. Biceps brachii. So it has two heads. Bi means two, ceps means head. Biceps brachii. All right, so let me inspect that. So biceps brachii, like I said, it has two heads. The short head is going to the coracoid process, and then the long head is going above the glenoid fossa, right? So this is the glenoid fossa here. You can see the long head is going above the glenoid fossa, right? And they're all attaching to, right? These two muscles are attaching to the radial tuberosity and the bicipital aponeurosis, right? Biceps brachii is responsible for glenohumeral and elbow flexion, as well as supination. So when I say supination, imagine holding a bowl of soup in your hands, right? Your palms are faced up. Supination. When they're face down, pronation. Supination, pronation. Supination, pronation. So when you have a bowl of soup in your hands, right, the arm is supinated, right? And then when you have your hands down, your palms down towards the ground, that's pronation, right? And then now we have the next muscle, which is brachialis. So we went over biceps brachii. The next muscle is brachialis. All right, so brachialis is going from the humeral shaft all the way to the ulnar tuberosity, and it's responsible for flexing the elbow. All right, and this is the bicipital aponeurosis. All right, and then the last muscle is the coracobrachialis. All right, so coracobrachialis is attaching from originates from the coracoid process and goes all the way to the humeral shaft. And this muscle is responsible for flexing the glenohumeral joint, right? And all three of these muscles that I just mentioned, the biceps brachii, the brachialis, and the coracobrachialis, are all innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve of the brachial plexus. Now that we have that down, let's start looking at the muscles in the posterior view. Right, the first muscle, right, deltoid. We went over this already. All right, so we said that deltoid attaches from the acromion process of the scapular spine, all the way to the humerus, and it's responsible for abducting, flexing, extending, medially and laterally rotating the glenohumeral joint. So it has a lot of functions. The next muscle that we're going to look at is trapezius. All right, so you can see trapezius here. So trapezius goes from the vertebra and the skull, and then distally attaches to, so it goes from the vertebra, skull, clavicle, and the scapular spine. Right, so it would attach here to the occipital bone, right? But it can't be seen in this view because we're only looking at the shoulder for the most part. But right, so it attaches from the vertebra, vertebra and skull to the clavicle and the scapular spine, and it elevates, depresses, retracts the scapula. So it elevates, depresses, and retracts the scapula. Right, and it also has an attachment to the acromion process as well. Okay, now we're going to be looking at the next muscle, which is levator scapulae. So to see levator scapulae, I would have to remove trapezius. Let me do that real quickly. Trying to see if I didn't have to do it, but I think I do. So I was trying to click it under the muscle, but it's fine. So I'll just remove trapezius. So we have to reflect trapezius to see levator scapulae. All right, so this is levator scapulae. It goes from the medial border of the scapula all the way to the vertebra. All right, so medial border of the scapula. So from the vertebra all the way to the medial border of the scapula. All right, so this is where it originates, from the vertebra, and then it attaches to the medial border of the scapula. And this muscle is responsible for retracting and rotating the scapula. Now we're going to look at rhomboid major and rhomboid minor. And also we can see that this is the medial border of the scapula. So now that we're going to look at rhomboid major and rhomboid minor. So rhomboid major, rhomboid minor. Let me click on that as well. So rhomboid major and rhomboid minor attach from the vertebra, right? We can see the vertebra here. Attached from the vertebra all the way to the medial border of the scapula. And these are going to deal with retracting the scapula. rhomboid major, rhomboid minor, scapular retraction. Now we're going to look at latissimus dorsi. All right, so we have latissimus dorsi here. Latissimus dorsi is going all the way from our vertebra all the way to our humeral shaft. So latissimus dorsi is going from our vertebra to our humeral shaft. And this muscle is responsible for adducting, extending, medially, and medially rotating the glenohumeral joint. So adducting, extending, and medially rotating the glenohumeral joint. Right, now that we have that down, we're going to look at the erector spinae muscles. Let me get that up real quick. All right, now we can see the erector spinae group, right? The first muscle of the erector spinae group is going to be spinalis, right? So we can denote this group with a mnemonic I love spine or spine love I, right? So the I is iliocostalis, the L is longissimus, and the S is spinalis. So we're looking at spinalis first here. Right, spinalis is directly surrounding the vertebra. Right, so both of these are spinalis. Spinalis, and then we have longissimus. Right, so both of these are longissimus. Right, and is going from the sacrum and the iliac crest all the way to the vertebra. Similarly with iliocostalis, right? Sacrum, iliac crest, all the way to the vertebra. All right, and these three muscle groups, the iliocostalis, which I just showed you, the longissimus, and the spinalis, they all are responsible for maintaining posture. So now that we have those three muscles down, we're going to go into the supra and infraspinatus muscles, right? So looking at some rotator cuff muscles. All right, so we have to reflect trapezius once again, right? Supraspinatus we can see right here. So supraspinatus, and it goes from the scapula, right, scapular spine, to the greater tubercle of the humerus. Right? So you can see it going from the anterior scapular and scapular spine to the greater tubercle of the humerus, right? You can see this is the greater tubercle, this is the lesser tubercle. Supraspinatus. Right? And it's responsible for abducting the glenohumeral joint. And now we're going to look at infraspinatus, right, which is just inferior. Right, infraspinatus, it goes from the scapula again to the greater tubercle of the humerus, and it's responsible for laterally rotating the glenohumeral joint. Right, so it's below the scapular spine, right? It's inferior to the scapular spine, whereas supraspinatus is anterior to the scapular spine. So, right, so supraspinatus is anterior to the scapular spine, whereas infraspinatus is posterior and inferior to the scapular spine. right? So this is responsible for laterally rotating the glenohumeral joint, infraspinatus, and supraspinatus is responsible for abducting the glenohumeral joint. Now we're going to look at teres major and teres minor. So let me get that out for you. Right, so this is teres major, this is teres minor. So teres major goes from the inferior angle of the scapula, right? So we said this is our inferior angle, to the anterior humeral shaft. So we see the humerus here, right, and the anterior aspect of it, right, below the greater and the lesser tuberosities, inferior to the greater and lesser tuberosities of the humerus. Teres major is responsible for adducting and medially rotating the glenohumeral joint. So adducting and medially rotating the glenohumeral joint. Whereas teres minor, it has a different attachment point. So teres minor goes from the lateral border of the scapula to the greater tubercle, right? So lateral border to the greater tubercle of the humerus, right? And it's responsible for laterally rotating the glenohumeral joint. Laterally rotating the glenohumeral joint. So that was teres minor. All right, so, and then the next muscle we're going to look at is subscapularis, right? So subscapularis, under the scapula, sub under, right? So subscapularis is going to go from the anterior scapula to the lesser tubercle of the humerus, right? And it's responsible for medially rotating the glenohumeral joint. Medially rotating the glenohumeral joint, so it's rotating it towards the midline of the body. Right now we're going to look at serratus anterior. Right, so we can see, before I go there, we can see how subscapularis is attaching to the anterior scapula. We can see it going all the way from the medial border all the way to the lesser tubercle of the humerus. Sorry, all the way to the greater tubercle of the humerus. Right, and it's responsible for medially rotating the glenohumeral joint. Yeah, so it's going from medial border, anterior scapula, to the lesser tubercle. I don't know why I said greater, so lesser tubercle of the humerus. All right, so now that we have that, we're going to move on to serratus anterior. All right, the way I remember this muscle is a serrated blade is very sharp, right? We can see how the muscle kind of has these blade-like, right, blade-like structure. So serratus anterior. All right, so serratus anterior, it goes from the medial border of the scapula. We can see it going from the medial border all the way to the ribs. All right, so medial border of the scapula to the ribs. And it's responsible for protracting the scapula. So the way I imagine, if I'm trying to retract my scapula, I'm kind of tensing my back, so um, my shoulders, right, move posteriorly, right, and protracting is moving my shoulders more anteriorly, right, towards the more anteriorly and medial, right, that's protraction. Whereas retraction is kind of tensing my back and moving my shoulders posteriorly. All right, and that would be protracting and retracting the scapula. All right, now we're going to move on to triceps brachii. Right, triceps brachii is the only muscle in the posterior arm. It has three heads, right? So 1, 2, 3. So medial head, long head, and lateral head. So we can see that here. Let me make sure the humerus is selected. Okay, we can see triceps brachii now. Let me click on the tendon. So the long head attaches to the scapula below the glenoid fossa, right? We see the glenoid fossa is here, so right below the glenoid fossa, the long head is attaching to. Um, the medial and the lateral heads attach to the humeral shaft, right? So this is the lateral head attaching to the humeral shaft, right below the greater tubercle or tuberosity of the humerus, and then we see the medial head attaching to the humerus, right? To the humeral shaft as well, right? And triceps brachii is responsible for glenohumeral and elbow extension, right? So the posterior is dealing with extension, anterior dealing with flexion. All right, and that's all the muscles that we need to know for this week. And now I'm going to move into brachial plexus. All right, so now we're going to look at the brachial plexus, right? So brachial meaning arm, plexus is a network of nerve or branches. So a network of nerve or branches in the arm, right? That go from the arm all the way down to your fingers, right? All the way from the axilla. Right, so the first thing, I'm not going to explain the entire brachial plexus. I'm just going to go over some general boundaries and borders. Right, so we go from the ventral rami, all the way, also known as roots. Right, so ventral rami, right, all the way up here, and then we go to the trunks, and then we go to the divisions, and then our divisions form our chords, and then our chords form our terminal branches, right? So we're only going to be looking and worrying about the chords for the most part into our terminal branches, right? And the way we can denote where our chords are, they're in relation to the axillary artery, right? So we go from subclavian vein, subclavian artery, right? Because it's under the clavicle, so subclavian. And then we move on to our axillary vein and artery, so axillary vein and artery. And then we move, once we're in the arm, we move to our brachial, right? Brachial artery and vein. So this is our, still our axillary. Let me move this way. Let me just remove. Okay. Let me just get the rest of the artery so we can see it. 1 second. All right, here we go. So, all right, so we went over our borders of blood vessels, right? So we have our subclavian vein, subclavian artery, and then we move on to our axillary vein, axillary artery, and then our axillary vein splits into our basalic vein and our brachial vein. So this is our basalic. Ooh, this is our basalic, right? It's a very superficial vein, whereas the let me go here. Whereas the brachial, right, is a lot more deep, right? So it's running with the brachial artery. All right, so our axillary vein splits into our basalic and brachial, and then our axillary artery continues on to form our brachial artery, right? So here we can see that. So I'm going to go over that one more time because it's slightly confusing. So we have our subclavian. Let me just move this. It's making it harder. Okay, so you have subclavian vein, subclavian artery, and then our subclavian vein and artery turn into our axillary artery and vein, and then our axillary vein splits into our basalic and our brachial. Basalic vein. All right, so let me click on the basalic vein so we can see this is axillary, this is basalic, and then here coming off of the basalic vein is our brachial vein. And let me just show you what that looks like. All right, so if I'm going to click on the, all right, if If I examine perfect. All right, so our axillary is splitting into our basalic and brachial. All right, and our brachial vein is running with our brachial artery, which is the continuation of the axillary artery. All right, so our brachial artery and vein are running together, and then we see running together, and they're moving deep. Whereas very superficially, we have our basalic vein. All right, and now I'm going to show you the cephalic vein. Right, so coming from the axillary vein, we have the cephalic vein. Right, cephalic vein. So I'm going to remove the brachial artery. Right, so we have our axillary vein splitting first to form the cephalic, and then it splits again to form the basalic and the brachial, as we saw. Right, so our cephalic, right, runs above, right, runs superiorly, and then it runs all the way down the arm laterally, whereas more medially we have the basalic, right, and these two veins are connected by the median cubital vein. Median cubital vein. Right, so coming off the axillary vein, sorry, coming off the axillary vein, we have the cephalic vein, and then later on the axillary vein splits into the basalic and the brachial. Right, the brachial vein and brachial artery are running with each other, and our axillary artery, oh my goodness, the axillary artery is continuing to form the brachial artery, which is running with the brachial vein. Right, which was one of the branches of the axillary artery, of the axillary vein. Oh my goodness, which is one of the branches of the axillary vein. Okay, so now that we have that, I'm going to show you the deep brachial artery and vein. Right, so remember, axillary vein gives off a branch to form the cephalic vein, and then our axillary vein splits later on to form our basalic and our brachial. Our axillary artery just continues on to form our brachial artery. And we have our median cubital vein, which is the connection point in between the cephalic vein and the basilic vein. Now we're going to go over the deep brachial artery and vein. Let me show you guys that real quick. All right, so now that we're going to be looking at the deep brachial artery and vein. So let me get a better image that we can see. Let me zoom in here. Okay. All right, so our deep brachial artery and vein are coming from our brachial artery and vein, right? So this is our basalic vein, right? So our deep brachial artery and vein are not coming from the basalic, they're coming from the brachial artery and vein. So I'm going to click on the brachial artery, I'm going to click on the brachial vein. Right? You can see that. I'm going to hide the basalic vein just so it doesn't confuse us. Okay. Right, so this is our basalic vein, right? It's a branch of our axillary vein. Right, but we're going to be looking at the other branch of the axillary vein, which is the brachial vein. So let me hide that one. Right, we can still see the axillary vein. I'm going to click on the brachial artery, brachial vein, and we can see, right after the axillary vein splits, right, we can see that coming from the brachial artery and the brachial vein, there's another branch, right? So arteria profunda brachii and profunda brachii vein, right? These are known as the deep brachial artery and the deep brachial vein, right? So deep brachial artery, deep brachial vein. Right, so we can see that they are coming off the brachial artery and the brachial vein. Right, so we can see that more from the anterior. Now, right, so we can see the deep brachial artery and the deep brachial vein going into the deeper compartment of the arm. All right, these are supplying the anterior muscles of the arm. well as some of the posterior, as well as the posterior one. All right, now we're going to move on into the brachial plexus. All right, so perfect. So slight correction: the deep brachial artery and vein only supply the posterior compartment of the arm. Right, only posterior, nothing anterior. Now that we have that down, we're going to move on to the brachial plexus. So brachial plexus here. Right, so brachial plexus is known as a network of nerve or branches, as I said previously. We're going to go through it slowly, and I'm just going to highlight the cords and the terminal branches. So let me just remove the lymph. Okay, the cords and the terminal branches. Okay. Right, so we go from, like I said, the roots, trunks, divisions, right? These are the divisions, right? Roots, trunk, divisions. And then we get to our cords and then terminal branches. Okay. So in relation to the axillary artery, in relation to the axillary artery is where our cords are denoting their name from, right? So this is our axillary artery. All right, we have more medially, we have our medial cord, right? So medial cord of the brachial plexus, right? Medial, right? On the medial side of the axillary artery. On the lateral side of the axillary artery, we have our lateral cord. And then under, let me remove this. Under, right, we have under under our under our axillary artery, we have the posterior cord. Posterior cord. Right, and coming from the medial cord, there's a bunch of medial cutaneous branches. So we have a medial cutaneous nerve of the arm and the forearm, and then you have the medial pectoral nerve as well. So that's our posterior cord, right? So posterior cord. So I'm gonna show you that. So posterior cord. All right, we went over our lateral cord, so we can see that lateral cord. We can see it's the lateral to the axillary artery, and then we have our medial cord. Medial cord, okay? Medial to the axillary artery. Let me press the axillary artery so we can see that a little bit better. All right, so lateral, medial, posterior. Right, and coming from the lateral cord, so our lateral cord is forming our musculocutaneous nerve and our median nerve. Right, it's forming a portion of our median nerve, right? So the way we know our musculocutaneous nerve, we know what it is, where it is, right? All right, the musculocutaneous nerve is innervating the anterior arm muscles, right? So that means brachialis, coracobrachialis, biceps brachii, those are all anterior arm muscles, and those are all innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve, right? Which is this nerve right here. Right, so it's going into coracobrachialis. So I'm going to deselect all of the other cords here, just so I can show you that. Hide, right? Ghost, right? So we can see the musculocutaneous nerve. Right, the musculocutaneous nerve is going into the coracobrachialis to innervate all of the anterior arm muscles. All right, so now we're going to look at the median. All right, so like I said, the lateral cord is forming the musculocutaneous and the median nerve, right? It's forming a portion of the median nerve and it's forming the musculocutaneous nerve. All right, so now that we have that down, we're going to move on to the median nerve. So our median nerve, right, so our median nerve is being formed by our lateral and our medial cord. Right, we're going on to form, right, our median nerve. Lateral medial cord, they form the median nerve. Right, and we can see our median nerve going all the way into the forearm. So our median nerve is going to innervate most anterior arm muscles, anterior forearm, so most anterior forearm muscles, right? So our musculocutaneous nerve is all anterior arm muscles. Our median nerve is innervating most anterior forearm muscles and some hand muscles. So we're going to go over forearm next week. Okay, now that we see our median nerve, right, coming from the medial and the lateral cords, we're going to go on to look at our radial nerve, right? So now we're going to be looking at the posterior cord. So posterior cord, right? Posterior cord. And coming from our posterior cord is our axillary nerve, right? So axillary nerve. Axillary nerve is going to innervate deltoid and teres minor, right? And it comes from our posterior cord, right? And then our posterior cord is splitting into the axillary nerve and the radial nerve. So we went over what axillary nerve does. Our radial nerve is going to innervate posterior arm and posterior forearm muscles. So that being the posterior arm muscle would be triceps brachii. And then we have a bunch of posterior forearm muscles that we'll go over next week that are being innervated by the radial nerve. Right, so, and let me just show you that. Right, we see the posterior cord, we see it splitting into the axillary nerve and the radial nerve. Okay, now that we have that down, we're going to be looking at the last thing coming from the medial cord. All right, so we have, let's press on the medial cord here. We saw that our medial cord is forming portions of our median nerve, but it is also forming our ulnar nerve as well. So, right, so we see medial cord going on to form the median and the ulnar nerve. Right, so our ulnar nerve, we can, it's going all the way in the axilla of the armpit, all that the axilla, otherwise known as the armpit, all the way to our forearm, right, and our hand. So our ulnar nerve is going to innervate some hand muscles. I mean most hand muscles and some anterior forearm muscles. So most hand muscles, so most of the muscles in your hand is going to be, they're going to be innervated by your ulnar nerve, and some of your anterior forearm muscles are going to be innervated by the ulnar nerve. So the ulnar nerve is innervating some anterior forearm and most hand muscles. So now that we have that down, so ulnar, some anterior forearm, and most hand muscles. And then the last two muscles that I'm going to go over are the medial pectoral nerve and the lateral pectoral nerve. So coming off the coming off the medial cord, we have the medial pectoral nerve along with the medial cutaneous nerves of the arm and forearm. So let's look for our medial cord. So we have our axillary artery. If we move medial, medial cord, right? And then coming off of our medial cord, we have our medial pectoral nerve, right? So medial cord, we have our medial pectoral nerve. Remember, the medial pectoral nerve is going to innervate pectoralis major, and it's going to innervate pectoralis minor. So pec major, pec minor, both innervated by the medial pectoral nerve coming off the medial cord of the brachial plexus. Right? And then for the lateral pectoral nerve, right, it's coming off the lateral cord. So this is our lateral cord, right? So if we look at the axillary artery, we move laterally. This is our lateral cord. And then coming off the lateral cord is our lateral pectoral nerve, as we can see here. Lateral pectoral nerve, it's only innervating pectoralis major. Right? And that's it for the brachial plexus. So I would suggest you guys slowing this video down and really looking at how the brachial plexus functions, and we'll go over more of this in lecture lab and office hours. Have a good rest of your week, guys.